Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today we have a really fascinating deep dive lined up for you.
We do. We are going to be looking at a system that, honestly, dictates pretty much everything else we examine on this show.
Right, it's the foundation.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we are using the source material from The Hidden History of the War on Voting by Thom Hartmann.
But we should probably clarify right up front, this is not a book review.
No, definitely not. We are not here to, critique the prose or give it a star rating.
Right.
We are using this text as an entry point. The actual subject we are examining is the system itself.
Specifically, we are doing a systems-level institutional analysis of how American electoral governance is designed.
And how that architecture shapes democratic participation and ultimately the distribution of power in the United States.
Because we tend to think of voting as an event. You go to the polls, you cast a ballot. It feels like a discrete action.
Right, like a game day.
Exactly. But we want to pull back and look at the whole environment. The constitutional compromises, the eligibility rules, ballot access, districting, judicial interpretation, and the administrative control mechanisms.
It is a massive scope. So to keep this structured for you, we have built this deep dive around a specific structural arc.
We are going to move through 5 distinct phases today.
First, we will look at design. Then we will move into incentives.
From there, we examine the outcomes of those incentives.
And persistence, basically why these systems are so hard to change.
And finally, interconnection, how this all ties back into the larger nested systems of our society.
So design, incentives, outcomes, persistence, and interconnection. Let's start right at the beginning. Section 1, design.
The constitutional architecture.
To really understand this design, we have to transport ourselves back to 1787.
Right. Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention.
And Hartmann's source material paints this really vivid, frankly, kind of uncomfortable picture of the context here.
It wasn't the sterile marble hall environment we like to imagine.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
We have this tendency to picture the founders as these totally stoic, perfectly rational figures making purely logical decisions.
But the reality was incredibly sticky.
Literally sticky. It was a brutal heat wave.
Right. No air conditioning, no deodorant.
And more importantly, it was an era before modern scientific rationalism had fully taken hold of the public consciousness.
Which brings us to the story of Mrs. Corbmacher.
Yes, I found this illustrative detail from the text completely wild. So you've got these delegates inside Independence Hall trying to draft a rational framework for a new nation.
And outside, literally in the streets of Philadelphia, there is a mob chasing a local woman.
Mrs. Corbmacher, a basket maker.
Right, because a young boy had died of heat stroke in this terrible weather.
But the local crowd didn't view it as a medical issue. They blamed her.
They accused her of witchcraft. They actually believed she had cast a spell to cause the heat wave.
The text notes the mob tried to cut her forehead.
To bleed the evil spirits out of her.
It's horrifying. But it perfectly illustrates the volatility of the era. The Constitution was drafted in a time where the rational world was just this super thin veneer.
Exactly. It was a society still heavily driven by superstition, fear, and the threat of mob violence.
And that fear wasn't just outside the building. The delegates inside were terrified of the mob too.
John Adams explicitly referred to them as the rabble.
So that fear, mixed with the hard political realities of the colonies, gave us our first major structural compromise.
The 3/5 compromise?
Right. Now, we all learn about this in school. The idea that an enslaved person counted as 3/5 of a person.
But it's usually presented as just this archaic, racist math equation.
What the source material does is drill down into the structural implication of that math. It wasn't just about census data.
It was entirely about leverage.
Break that down for us. What was the leverage?
Well, the southern slave states, led by Virginia, had a massive political problem. They had a lot of land and a lot of wealth.
But they didn't have the population numbers.
Exactly. Not free white citizens anyway. The northern states were much more densely populated with free workers and merchants.
So if representation in the new House of Representatives was based purely on the number of voting citizens, the North would dominate.
The North would completely run the government.
Yeah.
And the South knew this, so they demanded that their enslaved populations be counted to boost their representation.
Even though those enslaved people had absolutely zero rights.
Right. They were legally considered property. They obviously couldn't vote.
But their sheer physical presence was used to give their enslavers more power in Congress.
And the negotiated rate to make the math work for both sides was 3/5.
This is where the systems analysis gets really interesting. Because this didn't just stay in the House of Representatives.
No, it rippled outward, directly into the presidency.
Because of the Electoral College.
Right. The formula for the Electoral College is that each state gets electors equal to its number of House seats plus its 2 Senate seats.
So by artificially inflating the South's House seats with the 3/5 clause, the design artificially inflated their power to choose the president.
It was a massive structural thumb on the scale.
A permanent advantage embedded right into the architecture.
And the historical data bears this out completely. Hartmann notes that 4 of the first 5 U.S. presidents were Virginia slaveholders.
Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe.
That is not a coincidence. That is the system working exactly as it was engineered.
It was designed to give a property-holding minority a structural advantage over the deeper population centers.
Which brings us to the Electoral College itself as a design choice.
We hear a lot of defenses of the Electoral College today. And Hamilton's defense in Federalist Number 68 is usually the go-to argument.
Yes, Hamilton put a very sophisticated public relations spin on it.
He argued it was about ability and virtue. Right.
He claimed the college was a necessary buffer to prevent a foreign power from placing a, quote, stooge in the White House.
A stooge.
His stated fear was that a charismatic populist, maybe funded by a foreign adversary, could manipulate the uneducated public.
So the electors were supposed to be this layer of insulation, men of high virtue who would act as a filter.
They were designed to see through the ruse and stop a demagogue from taking power.
But the source material is pretty clear on how that specific design intent played out historically.
It failed.
Right. Hartmann analyzes this failure by looking at modern outcomes. He cites the election of Donald Trump as a prime example.
Where you had high concerns regarding foreign entanglement and populist manipulation, yet the college did not act as a filter at all.
He also points to the election of George W. Bush. In both of those cases, the candidate lost the national popular vote, but secured the presidency through the college.
So if the virtue filter was the goal, it hasn't worked.
But the analysis suggests that Hamilton's defense wasn't actually the primary driver for the design anyway.
No. The underlying driver brings us right back to demographics and slavery.
James Madison was actually quite explicit about this during the debates, wasn't he?
He was. A direct popular vote was a total non-starter for the South. If the president is chosen by popular vote, the North's demographic advantage makes the South irrelevant.
So the Electoral College was the compromise. It allowed the slave states to carry that 3/5 mathematical bonus into the executive branch.
It was a buffer against democracy, built to protect a very specific set of property interests.
Okay, there was one more crucial piece of this initial design architecture: the Senate.
The Senate is the ultimate anchor of this asymmetrical design.
2 senators per state, regardless of how many people live there.
Now, in 1787, the population difference between the largest and smallest states was significant, but it wasn't astronomical.
But today, that imbalance has grown exponentially.
It has. The text points out that today, the 25 smallest states control 50 seats in the Senate. That is half the chamber.
But those 25 states represent what percentage of the actual population?
Only about 16%.
So 16% of the population has 50% of the power in the upper chamber.
Which effectively creates a permanent structural veto point.
A tiny minority of the population can completely block legislation that the vast majority of the country wants.
And again, applying our systems lens, this isn't a malfunction. This is the architecture working as intended.
It is protecting the interests of smaller states and originally slaveholding states against majority rule.
So that is the foundational design. Asymmetry is built right into representation itself before a single ballot is even cast.
Which transitions us perfectly into Section 2 of our arc: incentives.
Right. Why do these restrictions persist? Why restrict participation at all?
To understand the incentive structure, we have to look at the core philosophical tension that the founders wrestled with.
It is the tension between the rights of persons and the rights of property.
Hartmann pulls a quote from James Madison that lays this bare.
Madison warned that if the rights of persons were prioritized over the rights of property, the poor would, quote, sacrifice the rich.
Sacrifice the rich. That is an incredibly stark way to put it.
It reveals a profound fear of wealth redistribution.
If you give the have-nots the power to vote, they will simply vote to take resources from the haves.
John Adams shared this exact fear. He believed that men without property had no independent judgment.
He thought they would either be easily manipulated by demagogues, or they would just use the ballot box to loot the national treasury. So the foundational incentive to restrict the vote is deeply economic.
Absolutely. It is about protecting concentrated wealth from popular democratic control.
And what the source material argues is that this incentive didn't just vanish when we moved into the modern era.
It adapted. The strategy evolved.
And Hartmann points to a very specific document from 1971 as the catalyst for the modern version of this strategy, the Powell Memo.
This is such a critical piece of the puzzle. Lewis Powell, before he became a Supreme Court justice, was a highly influential corporate lawyer.
He wrote a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce
Titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System.
Set the scene for us. What was happening in 1971 that prompted this?
You have to look at the cultural shifts of the 1960s. You had a massive rise in the environmental movement.
Right, the EPA was just getting started.
You had the consumer protection movement spearheaded by people like Ralph Nader. Labor unions were still quite strong.
The anti-war movement was highly mobilized.
Powell looked at all this civic participation and saw an existential threat to corporate power.
He felt that the business community was losing the culture war.
He thought they were being entirely too passive, so his memo was a call to arms. He urged the chamber to stop being the silent majority and to actively weaponize their wealth.
Weaponize it how? Where did he tell them to focus?
He told them to pour immense resources into politics, into the media landscape, and most importantly, into the judiciary.
The courts.
He explicitly identified the judicial system as the most crucial instrument for protecting the enterprise system.
He was basically laying out a blueprint to take over the legal apparatus to shield corporate interests from public regulation.
And this memo activated a network of incredibly wealthy individuals, people like Richard Scaife, Joseph Coors, and eventually the Koch brothers.
They started building an entire infrastructure. Think tanks, legal foundations, political action committees.
All designed to reshape the judiciary and, critically, to reshape the electorate itself.
Which connects directly to this concept Hartmann discusses called the commons.
This is the underlying economic battleground. The commons refers to the things we all collectively own.
The air, the water, public infrastructure, public lands.
The incentive for concentrated wealth is to exploit or control the commons for private profit.
But if you want to, say, dump industrial runoff into a local river to save on waste disposal costs, you have a problem.
Your problem is the people who rely on that river for drinking water.
If those people have unfettered access to the ballot box, they will vote for politicians who will regulate your runoff.
Exactly. So restricting their vote is a highly rational, incentive-aligned strategy to maintain your control over those public assets.
If the rabble can vote, they might demand clean water or higher wages. So the imperative is to ensure they cannot vote effectively.
The source also details a complementary political strategy developed around this time, the two Santa Clauses theory.
This is a fascinating bit of political psychology.
It was developed by a strategist named Jude Wanniski.
Break down the logic of the two Santa Clauses for us.
Wanniski observed that throughout the mid-20th century, the Democrats had successfully positioned themselves as the Santa Claus Party.
By establishing programs like Social Security, Medicare, and various social safety nets.
Meanwhile, the Republicans had traditionally played the role of the deficit hawk, the Scrooge, essentially, always warning about the budget and refusing to spend money.
And as Wanniski pointed out, nobody votes for Scrooge.
Right, so he proposed a radical shift. When Republicans gain power, they shouldn't act like Scrooge. They should become the tax cut Santa Claus.
Meaning they should pass massive tax cuts, primarily benefiting the wealthy and corporations, completely ignoring the impact on the national debt.
This makes them extremely popular with their donor base.
But it intentionally explodes the federal deficit.
That is the second part of the strategy. The explosion of debt is a feature, not a bug, because when the Democrats inevitably retake power, they are handed this massive deficit.
And then the Republicans pivot right back to being deficit hawks.
They scream about the national debt, the very debt they just created, and use it as the justification to demand deep cuts to social spending.
It is an engineered pincer movement. Starve the government of revenue, then use the resulting crisis to dismantle the safety net.
But for a strategy like that to work long-term, it relies heavily on controlling the electorate.
You have to make sure the people who rely most heavily on those safety nets have the hardest time pushing back at the polls.
Which leads us directly into Section 3, outcomes.
We've looked at the design and the incentives. Now we need to examine the actual mechanisms. How does this system operationalize the restriction of participation?
This is where we shift from broad philosophy to granular bureaucracy. Hartmann details how modern voter suppression is largely administrative.
It is not usually visible violence at the polling place anymore. It is buried in spreadsheets and administrative code.
Let's start with a mechanism called interstate cross-check.
This sounds so incredibly mundane. It sounds like an accounting software.
And that mundane framing is part of its power. In theory, interstate cross-check was a database designed to find people who might be registered to vote in more than one state.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable. If I move from Ohio to Michigan and forget to cancel my old registration, cleaning that up makes sense.
In theory, yes. But Hartmann's analysis shows that in practice, it functioned as a massive purge machine.
Because of how the system identified these supposed duplicate voters.
Right, the matching criteria were shockingly loose. The system primarily flagged matches based simply on the first and last name.
Just the first and last name, ignoring middle names or generational suffixes like junior or senior.
Often entirely ignoring them, and ignoring discrepancies in Social Security numbers or dates of birth.
So if there is a David Smith registered in Georgia and a different David Smith registered in Texas, the system flags them as a potential criminal double voter.
Exactly. Now think about the demographics of common surnames in the United States.
Names like Washington, Jackson, Garcia, Martinez.
These names are extremely common, and they are disproportionately found within Black and Hispanic communities.
So by using this loose matching criteria, the database systematically flagged millions of minority voters as fraudulent.
And states use those flags as justification to quietly purge them from the voter rolls.
So you think you are registered, you show up on election day, and the poll worker tells you you aren't in the system.
And you have no idea why. Another administrative tactic discussed in the source is called caging.
How does caging operate?
It relies on the Postal Service. A political operative or organization sends a piece of direct mail, usually a postcard, to registered voters in a highly targeted district.
And they mark this mail as "do not forward."
Right. So if the person has moved, or if they are a college student in a new dorm, or a soldier deployed overseas, the post office returns the card as undeliverable.
And then the operative uses that return postcards as legal evidence to challenge the voter's registration status.
They present it to the election board and say, look, this address is invalid, strike this person from the rolls.
This very clearly targets transient populations, renters, students, lower-income families who move more frequently.
It uses housing stability as a proxy for wealth and effectively filters the electorate based on that stability.
Let's move to a much more public mechanism. Strict voter ID laws.
This is the one that gets the most media attention.
The stated justification for these laws is always election security, preventing in-person voter fraud.
But the text is absolutely clear on the data regarding in-person fraud.
It is statistical ghost.
It is virtually non-existent. You are talking about a fraction of a percent of all votes cast. It simply does not happen on a scale that affects outcomes.
So if the problem being solved isn't real, what is the actual structural outcome of the policy?
The outcome is exclusion. Strict ID laws dictate exactly which forms of identification are acceptable.
And they often accept IDs typically held by older, wealthier demographics, like a concealed carry permit or a driver's license,
while simultaneously rejecting forms of ID held by younger or less affluent demographics, like state university student IDs.
The source provides a very concrete example of this from Wisconsin.
Yes, looking at Wisconsin during the Scott Walker era, the data is devastating. In the 2016 election, reports indicated that roughly 17,000 registered voters were turned away at the polls because they lacked this specific required ID.
17,000 people physically turned away.
But the systemic impact is actually much larger. Estimates suggest that up to 300,000 eligible citizens in Wisconsin lacked the specific documentation required to even register in the first place under the new laws.
300,000 people in a swing state where elections are routinely decided by fewer than 30,000 votes.
By changing the denominator of who is allowed to participate, you entirely change the mathematical outcome of the election.
And beyond paperwork, there are literal physical barriers. Polling place closures.
Hartmann highlights data from North Carolina that really illustrates this. After the Supreme Court altered the Voting Rights Act, North Carolina closed 158 polling locations.
And they didn't close them evenly across the state.
No. They were heavily concentrated in the 40 counties with the highest African-American populations.
This leads directly to a phenomenon researchers call the weight gap.
The text cites a comprehensive study from MIT on this.
The disparity in wait times is staggering.
Nationwide, the study found that Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line to vote than white voters.
And black voters wait 200% longer.
200% longer. When you force a specific demographic to wait 4, 5, 6 hours in line, you are essentially imposing a tax on their time.
And if you are an hourly worker, or if you lack childcare, you simply cannot afford to pay that tax. You have to leave the line.
It structurally privileges voters who have salary jobs, flexible hours, and leisure time.
Now, we also need to cover gerrymandering. This is the mechanism that essentially short-circuits the whole democratic feedback loop.
Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing district lines not to represent communities, but to guarantee a specific partisan outcome.
The text uses Wisconsin again as a textbook example of how extreme this can get.
Looking at the 2012 state assembly elections in Wisconsin, the Democrats actually won a clear majority of the statewide popular vote. They received 53% to the Republicans' 47%.
So in a proportional system, the Democrats would control the state assembly.
But the districts had been drawn so surgically, packing Democratic voters into a few dense urban districts and cracking the rest across rural areas, that the results were completely inverted.
Even though the Republicans lost the popular vote by a significant margin, they won 60 out of the 99 seats.
A near supermajority of the legislative power, despite having minority support from the public.
That severs the core premise of representative government. The politicians are effectively selecting their voters rather than the voters selecting their politicians.
So those are the outcomes, the physical and administrative realities of the design.
Which brings us to the most perplexing question for a lot of people. Section 4. Persistence.
Why does this persist? Why can't citizens just take this to the courts and have it struck down?
This is the part of the deep dive that really challenges fundamental assumptions. Because we are taught that we have a sacred constitutional right to vote.
We use that phrase all the time, the right to vote.
But Hartmann clarifies a very harsh legal reality here.
The United States Constitution does not affirmatively grant any citizen the right to vote.
I think we need to emphasize that. It is completely absent from the text.
What the Constitution does is list specific reasons why the state cannot deny you the vote.
Right. It says the state cannot deny you based on race, which is the 15th Amendment,
Right.
or based on sex, the 19th, or based on age, if you are over 18, the 26th.
It is a negative liberty. It restricts the state's reasons for exclusion, but it never establishes a baseline affirmative right that belongs to the citizen.
And the Supreme Court explicitly confirmed this interpretation in the year 2000.
Yes, in the Bush versus Gore decision. The majority opinion stated in incredibly plain language, quote, "The individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the President of the United States."
It is stunning to read that in a Supreme Court ruling.
The court's legal logic is that the Constitution grants state legislatures the plenary power to appoint electors. The legislature can choose to delegate that choice to the public via a popular vote, but they are not constitutionally obligated to do so.
This lack of an affirmative right is the structural void where all of these suppression mechanisms operate.
Exactly. Because if there is no inherent right, the burden of proof shifts.
The state doesn't have to prove why it should be allowed to restrict you. The citizen has to prove why they deserve access.
And in recent years, the judicial branch has actively amplified these restrictions rather than checking them.
The source focuses heavily on the 2013 case, Shelby County versus Holder.
This was a monumental shift. This ruling essentially gutted the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
It removed what was called the preclearance provision.
Under preclearance, states and jurisdictions that had a documented historical record of racial discrimination in voting had to get federal approval before they could change their election laws.
The federal government had to verify that the new laws wouldn't harm minority voters.
But the court struck that formula down, and the outcome was immediate.
Literally within hours of the ruling.
States like Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia immediately implemented strict ID laws and aggressive voter purge programs that almost certainly would have been blocked under the old preclearance rules.
The judiciary removed the guardrails,
Then you pair that with the Citizens United decision in 2010.
which equated the spending of corporate money in elections with free speech.
This creates a closed, self-reinforcing feedback loop.
Break that loop down for us.
Concentrated wealth uses unlimited campaign spending to elect specific politicians. Those politicians then draw gerrymandered districts to protect themselves, and they appoint federal judges who share their ideology.
And those judges then issue rulings that further protect concentrated wealth and further restrict voter access.
The system actively insulates itself from democratic accountability.
Hartmann also highlights a more recent, somewhat under-the-radar legal strategy aimed at shifting power, the Evenwell versus Abbott case.
This case reveals the ultimate logical conclusion of this incentive structure. The strategy is referred to as numbers, not voters.
What was the conservative legal argument in Evenwell?
Traditionally, when states draw legislative districts, they base the population counts on the total number of residents in the area.
Which includes everyone. Children, non-citizens, people who are incarcerated. Everyone gets counted for representation.
The plaintiffs in Evenwell argued that districts should only be drawn based on the population of eligible voters.
So excluding children and non-citizens from the count, what is the structural goal of that shift?
Demographics. Urban areas, which tend to lean heavily Democratic, have much higher concentrations of young people and immigrant populations.
While rural areas, which lean Republican, tend to have older, whiter populations with fewer non-citizens.
So if you change the formula to only count eligible voters, you effectively strip massive amounts of political representation away from diverse urban centers and transfer that power directly to older rural districts.
It is an attempt to engineer the fundamental math of representation so that certain bodies literally do not count in the equation of power.
Even though the Supreme Court didn't fully mandate this shift in Evenwell, it exposed the ongoing strategic effort to redefine representation entirely.
Which brings us to the final section of our analysis, Section 5, interconnection.
This is where we look at the crisis in perception itself.
The source makes it clear that we cannot view these mechanisms, the ID laws, the purges, the gerrymandering, as isolated incidents.
They are not administrative glitches. They are not simply partisan bickering.
They are the predictable, engineered outputs of a design system.
To illustrate this, Hartmann points to a major 2014 study from Princeton University conducted by Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page.
The white noise study.
Right. They analyzed decades of public policy outcomes to see whose preferences actually translate into law.
And the findings are incredibly sobering.
They found that for the bottom 90% of income earners in the United States, their support or opposition to a proposed policy has essentially zero statistical impact on whether that policy becomes law.
The preferences of 90% of the population are statistically equivalent to white noise.
The system simply does not respond to them. The only statistically significant correlation they found was between legislative outcomes and the preferences of the top 10%, specifically economic elites and corporate lobbying groups.
So the restriction of the vote at the administrative level is inextricably linked to the maintenance of this oligarchy at the policy level.
It is the realization of Madison's design to protect property, supercharged by modern administrative and judicial tools.
So we have to ask the question explicitly. What is the crisis in perception here?
The misperception is how we frame these events in our daily lives.
We look at a 6-hour line at a polling place in Atlanta, and we perceive it as local incompetence.
Or we look at a voter roll purge in Ohio and frame it as just a partisan legal squabble.
We perceive these things as malfunctions of a democratic system.
But the structural reality, the layer that remains obscured, is that the system is not malfunctioning at all.
Focusing on individual bad actors or isolated scandals completely hides the durable incentive architecture underneath.
A systems-level analysis shifts our visibility. It reveals that electoral restriction is not a deviation from the norm.
It is the predictable output of an institutional structure that was designed from the very beginning to filter participation and protect concentrated power.
Once you see the architecture, you understand that the outcomes are intentional.
Now, the source material does briefly overview some potential structural solutions. We aren't here to advocate for policy, but we should outline what the text identifies as mechanical countermeasures to this architecture.
Hartmann identifies several distinct reform efforts. First is the For the People Act,
Which is essentially an attempt to standardize access at the federal level.
Right. It would establish national baselines that override state-level restrictions, mandating things like early voting and restricting aggressive purges.
Another mechanism mentioned is automatic voter registration.
This alters the default setting of the system. Currently, registration is opt-in. You have to navigate the bureaucracy to participate.
Automatic registration makes it opt-out. If you interact with a government agency like the DMV, you are automatically registered unless you decline.
It structurally aligns the system with participation rather than exclusion.
The text also discusses statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico.
This addresses the massive structural imbalance in the Senate we discussed earlier.
By granting representation to millions of tax-paying American citizens who currently have no voice in the upper chamber.
He also outlines the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact,
which is a mechanism to bypass the Electoral College without needing a constitutional amendment.
Participating states pledge all of their electoral votes to whichever candidate wins the overall national popular vote.
If states representing 270 electoral votes join the compact, it essentially neutralizes the structural distortions of the Electoral College design.
And finally, the text emphasizes the necessity of paper ballots,
which seems almost regressive in a digital age, but mechanically, it is crucial.
Electronic voting systems are inherently vulnerable to tampering, closed-source algorithms, and undetectable failures.
Paper ballots provide a physical, auditable trail. They ensure that the structural integrity of the vote tally can be independently verified.
It is a structural defense against administrative manipulation.
So those are the counter mechanisms the source provides.
But the core takeaway of this analysis isn't any single policy. It is the framework itself.
Exactly. Understanding that we are operating within an inherited architecture.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.